Hello, everyone. We're so excited to have you here. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Alyssa, and I work for The Word, a storytelling sanctuary. And we are co hosting this event. We are a nonprofit organization working to build a publishing community that will fight for inclusivity. Our mission is to promote voices from underserved communities and diverse backgrounds, to honor the stories of those that have faced adversity and injustice, and to provide a sanctuary space where we can see ourselves in literature. To learn more about us, you can visit our website, thewordfordiversity.org. Again, that's thewordfordiversity.org. And I am so thrilled to partner with Duende District. Representing Duende is the founder and owner, Angela Maria Spring. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you, Alyssa. It's always wonderful to see you.
Cool that we've
I
actually met in person now.
I know, right? Like we're like that.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
that.
Right,
Thank
and
you so much.
Angela is going to introduce our amazing speakers.
Thank you. Bienvenidos, mi gente. As always, so much love and gratitude to our partners, The Word, who have been working with us on this phenomenal virtual series the past 2 years. Again, I'm Angela Maria Spring. I'm the owner of Duende District, a collaborative pop-up bookstore by and for people of color where all are welcome, with current locations in Washington, D.C. and Albuquerque, New Mexico. For those of you who are new to our bookstore story, the cornerstone of the Duende Project is about the collective, the community, and the creation of decolonized literary spaces that center and celebrate Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I am so excited for this conversation today with Megan Giddings, author of The Women Could Fly, and Jamie Figueroa, author of Brother, Sister, Mother, Explorer. They are both incredibly talented authors whose powerful genre bending writing is brilliant and also so important. Both their books ask the essential question of what could we do? Who could we be if we had true individual freedom? And what would that freedom look like? I know many more people are grappling with that reality right now in the wake of Roe versus Wade being revoked, but Black and Indigenous women, as well as Black and Indigenous gender nonconforming and trans people, have dealt with the white supremacist Christian nationalist carceral state for centuries, as it often violently enforces its will upon their bodies, from forced sterilization to systemized racist prenatal and postpartum care, and even the birth control pill. I like to remind people of this a lot. Even the birth control pill was created through non-consensual testing of Boricuas, so my people, Jamie's people. And it has suppressed, outlawed, and erased our ancestral knowledge, medicine, and grieving ceremonies. These systems want nothing more to suppress than to suppress our imaginations as well. For if we cannot imagine freedom, how can we fight for it? That is why writers such as Megan and Jamie are vital to our cultural ecosystems. Their stories empower our collective imagination to continue to resist, evolve, and nurture each other. So I invite you to join me in appreciation for our guests sharing the gift of their imaginations and their writing with us. So we'll set aside time at the end for audience questions, but feel free to put questions in the chat anytime. And please, if you can, purchase both these fantastic books. We'll drop links in the chat. If you choose to purchase the books with Duende District, we thank you because without your support, we can't do this work. Also, we are currently donating 20% of all of our online bookshop sales to aid our beloved island, Boriken. So thank you for all that, and let's learn more about our wonderful guests. So Jamie Figueroa received her MFA in creative writing from the Institute of American Indian Arts. Her writing has appeared in Epic, McSweeney's, and American short fiction. She is the recipient of the Truman Capote Scholarship and is a Bread Loaf Scholar. Boricua by the way of Ohio, Figueroa lives in northern New Mexico, and you can also purchase her book, Brother, Sister, Mother, Explorer. And Megan Giddings is an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota. Her first novel, Lakewood, was one of New York Magazine's top 10 books of 2020, an NPR Best Book of 2020, a Michigan Notable Book for 2021, a finalist for 2 NAACP Image Awards, and was a finalist for an LA Times Book Prize in the Ray Bradbury Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Speculative category. Megan's writing has received funding and support from the Barbara Deming Foundation in Hedgebrook, and she lives in the Midwest. And I am so excited to hear Megan read and then have this conversation. So let's take it away. You're on mute.
A whole book tour online before this, and finally the mute button got me. Anyway, okay, let's get warmed up. So what I was saying, and I'll say it much quicker because we've got a very small amount of time, as I was just saying thank you to Angela for having us and how honored I am to be just in community with you all tonight. So I'm going to read very briefly from my second novel, The Women Could Fly. And within the novel, the only thing that you should know is that there are stories within stories. And I'm going to read one of the very short stories within stories for you all. When I was a child, my mother used to tell me a story she called The Witch in the Garden of Life. Once upon a time, there was a woman a witch loved very much. For her beloved, the witch created a garden. Every tree flourished with fruit, golden berries for knowledge, ruby melons for fulfillment, onyx apples for respite, sapphire persimmons for passion. When the garden was in full bloom, the witch led her beloved out among the soft grasses and through the hedges. Most people will be able to eat only one kind of fruit, the witch said. Some two, some none. But the chosen fruit shows their heart's truest desire. Choose your life. The witch gestured at the multicolored abundance, her face glowing with the pride of knowing she alone had made all this. The lover walked around. Each fruit had its own wonderful perfume, but she couldn't choose a single one. Even the bees, the birds, the wind could choose, and the thought made her miserable. When the witch's back was turned, she went back into their cottage, shuttered all their windows, and sat in the dim firelight. It was better when making a decision, the woman felt, to see only the shape of things. When I heard this story in school, it had a different ending. The witch and the woman weren't lovers, just good friends. Choose your life, the witch said in each version. The best friend walked around. She stopped and smelled each fruit and settled on amethyst grapes. They would mean a happy marriage, a house filled with children, a comfortable life. This is how my mother ended the story the last time she told it. After reflecting in the darkness for 3 days, the lover woke up on the 4th day with certainty. She rummaged through the witch's pantry, overturning jars of herbs and black as night cauldrons, until she found a small sack of seeds. The woman took them outside, dug at the earth with her nails and fingers until they bled. Her fingernails cracked. She wheezed and sighed and sweated, but when the lover was done, she had planted her own row. There could be grapes, there could be flowers, there could be thorns. It didn't matter. Whatever bloomed was hers.
Thank you so much, Megan, for reading that. I'm glad that's on your list that you read and that you share with folks. And it's such a gorgeous passage. And I love the stories within stories. I want to say quickly thank you to Alyssa and the Word, and thank you to Angela at Duende District. Thank you for the vision and the community and the powerful and impactful support. It's so essential, and I'm deeply grateful. I would love to hear, Megan, how has magic appeared in your life recently?
Recently, I don't think it has, which has been interesting. But every time I say that, like throughout tour, people have been asking me, like, how long have you been able to see the future? And I always say, no, I don't. And then they disagree with me. So maybe that, in its way, that repetition of people saying the same thing, even though there are parts of me that push against that idea simply because it's not prescience in some ways. It's tied into when books are released, and it's just kind of coincidence. But at the same time, I also have that kind of woo feeling of when many people say the same thing, it at least points you toward what you should be looking at. So I guess maybe the magic is just telling me to look at the future, to think deeply and radically about what it could be or what I want.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm curious also the way in which your book is being sort of seen as the ability for you to tell the future, or your ability to make commentary in a very wise and astute way, in a kind of multidimensional experiential way. And I'm curious about your process of writing, and I'm curious about sort of the magic that happens, the sort of spirit that happens. If you feel comfortable about talking about it, sort of the seen and the unseen forces. Of course, we know as writers all of the hard work and the time in the chair that it takes. But I'm also curious to hear about the space that you make for ancestors, the space that you make for the knowing that is underneath of the knowing, right? That most people in the dominant culture maybe don't access as readily as artists and writers.
Yeah. So on the general level, and I feel like all writers lately that I talk to are doing this, but I do start with tarot cards sometimes where I don't believe that they see the future, but I do believe that the things that you notice and the things that you can communicate to yourself through it, either from just the very act of having to tell a story about what's happening in your life by drawing the cards. But again, it's repetitions. And what do repetitions make you think about? And I, I've been saying the word repetition a lot already during this, but it's been on my mind a lot. And this is related, but it's going to sound initially not related. I'm trying at the moment to write an essay about Octavia Butler, and hopefully it happens and comes out. And one of the arguments I'm trying to make is that what sometimes we call prescience is actually shows how often history rhymes, how often we get to the point of progress, at least in the United States, and then there's not policy or law that follows the progress that people want to make. And when I was getting ready for this book to come out, my UK publisher had me write a letter, and I was quoting a feminist collective that met in Ohio in the 1970s, and they were Black feminists. And the letter that they wrote is really, it could have been written today about how, in terms of actually advocating for trans rights, for queer rights, for wanting to be lovely human. And just last week, I was on the phone with my brother, and he's a PhD student in African American diaspora studies. And he was telling me about how he'd read something from 50 years earlier that was from a Harlem women's feminist collective that was, again, advocating for those same things. And so I'm starting to think about it when we talk about prescience. Is it a way to pave over sometimes just the failures of the state we live in, and how often we aren't taught our history, or we don't even have the resources to look and see how many people before us were trying to build these bridges and paths. And I think when I think about the ancestors that I'm trying to find, more and more after being able to articulate what I'm looking for maybe are these failures, but the people who are in this lineage of, even though progress takes so long and is so frustratingly within and out of reach, we have to honor our ancestors by continuing their work. We have to keep trying and there have been people for so long on this world, and still we're just arguing to treat everyone levelly as a person. Sometimes I think that's like the great human issue that we don't even want to make so simple. We want to say it's all these other things. But on a very basic level, it's we all deserve to be treated levelly as human.
Absolutely. And that brings me back to the stories within the stories, and also the grand story of the novel, but the way in which there are kinds of stories, right? The kinds of stories we tell each other that take humanity away. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about some of the interrogators of the state that Josephine had to contend with. And I'm thinking about the ways in which we also have the kinds of stories that heal us and the kinds of stories that help us to re-engage our imagination and decolonize our imagination, right? And I'm also curious, Megan, it seemed as though this book took about 4 years to write. Is that about?
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
About right. And I'm interested in the way in which transformation occurs, right, for the reader, for the viewer in creative artistic works or written literary works. I'm also really interested in hearing about the transformation that happens for the artist or the writer.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, how are you a different person now than you were when you started writing this book? How did the work itself inform you and actively sort of recreate you as you were creating it?
It's the complicated thing where, on the one hand, I found like the very idea of writing this book much easier than writing my first book, for the simple fact, like, I knew I could write a novel. And you know how it is, where like you write the first novel the whole time, you're like, do I know how to even write? Do I even know how to write a book? But even though it's still hard, there's a difference between like following a path. Like, you know, you can make a book, you know, you can make things come together. But I think I made myself the most vulnerable I've ever been writing when I wrote this book. I feel personally, I still feel really tender as a person. I had to be really open and honest and available to write The Women Could Fly. I had to let Josephine, and she and I are very, very different people, but in terms of the ways that we view the world, I think we're really close in the sense that we're both very inherently lonely people. I think it's just an aspect of my personality in some ways. But I think the key difference between me and Josephine is I keep persisting. I sit in the vulnerability. And the more comfortable I am with vulnerability, I mean, yeah, sometimes I cry all the time, either out of rage or out of just the fact that, like, it's that human emotion. You're being vulnerable and open. But I've also never felt better about myself or just more comfortable in my skin than being able to say, okay, I'm just a very soft person, and I've always been described as high strung, and now I'm like, yeah, and that makes me a better writer. Yeah, that makes me actually able to make people. It makes it so I can have fun. And I'd gone a long path through, like a lot of people. I kind of thought that writing might be a little bit of a therapy or a therapeutic. No, writing isn't therapy. It brings everything back up. It makes everything a raw nerve, and then you got to go to real therapy.
Exactly. Yeah, I appreciate all of that that you're sharing, and it feels so true. And I think there's also something that we can do as writers, where the things that have been said to us that feel offensive and limiting, you're too sensitive or too perceptive, or is trying to make meaning out of something, or too earnest, or all these things, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes even being mixed heritage or mixed race, where you're feeling like I'm always on the outside of something, right? How can those in turn be used as superpowers, which they actually are, right?
They actually are. And I mean, it's just such a complicated, beautiful question that I'm just processing it for a second.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I think the thing that I'm getting bumped on is the part of the mixed heritage where lately I've had less patience at the idea. And this is specifically like a Black mixed heritage thing, where I am mixed race, but I just identify as Black. No one's ever stopped.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, it's only usually other Black people who are like, oh yeah, you're mixed. I'm like, yep. That's true. But I think a lot about how, and maybe it's just the place we're in, but I think because we're with the word and everything Angela said, but one of the frustrations I've always had when people, especially other people who are mixed race Black, tell me like they don't feel like they fit in, and I want to tell them like, the more Black friends you have, the more you'll hear them say the same thing. Like white supremacy is what builds this idea of what Blackness is. And then constantly it's gatekeeping it and telling you, okay, you aren't Black enough, you aren't this thing, but slavery destroyed Blackness in this country. We had a cultural genocide. And I mean, there are many other groups in this country who have also experienced cultural and physical genocides. And again, it's the thing that kind of bonds us together. We're building our culture. And so that outsiderness, I always want to say, like, let's build something beautiful. Let's build our culture back. Your books, your words, the ways that you inhibit your Blackness, your culture, it's beautiful and important. We need it. Don't come in. You're Black. Let's keep making it so that our children will also have this cultural heritage, that maybe they won't be saying the same things or feel gatekept out of like what is beautiful about their existence.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's their own individual expression, right? That's also in concert with community expression, right? It reminds me of something that Sherry Mitchell, the Penobscot author of Sacred Instruction, talks about. She talks about sovereignty, and they have a name in her language, in the Penobscot language. I own myself. And it also means that that's with all the rights and responsibilities that goes along with that, right? It's not I own myself, therefore I can blow up the world. It's I own myself, and therefore I deeply understand how that's in relationship with, right? And I'm just, I'm so grateful for the way in which your book points at that creativity and the imagination, and also in community, right? And so I'm curious if you can also speak to Josephine's experience in the book as being, in a way, it's her expression and her quest for sovereignty, with all the rights and responsibilities that go along with that, and the dominant culture's, constant force of desperately trying to take that away from her, right?
Right.
Such as we're experiencing with women and people of color, absolutely. But I just love that connection with sovereignty, creativity, and imagination, especially in the way in which we are the way in which your book invites the active decolonizing of the imagination for the reader and for the community at large. And if you could just speak to that.
Yeah, I can definitely. And also, will you send me the title of what you were referencing? Because I love everything you just said. And
yeah,
I was really just moved hearing you lay that out. And I feel like the whole book might change something in me now that I heard that. Anyway, back to my book for a second. When I was conceiving of this novel, I was thinking a lot about how I grew up, and I loved all of those books about magic. I mean, even Harry Potter, I loved it because I love magic and I love play, and I love almost any book that makes me feel like I'm not on Earth for a little while. But I was thinking a lot about like the issues I've had with those books, and there's always someone who's special, who's chosen, and it reflects capitalism. You have one special chosen person, and the other people kind of give them some tools, but they don't really get recognized. And this person grows in prominence. And I wanted to think a lot about the magic of being in solidarity with one another, the magic of friendship, the magic of I need other people. And the only way I'm going to survive is with other people. And I just love how you tied it to sovereignty, because so often it is true that sovereignty, it so often gets used as a way to take. And you just keep making borders. You keep pushing people outside. And what does it mean to make a sovereignty where you're free to go and you're free to stay and you're always free to be family? And I really wanted to explore what that looks like in a novel, and what does it look like on many levels, where there's still, I can't talk about that because that's too much of a spoiler for part of the book, but there's something that I was leading toward in the middle of the book to talk about that, but there's still levels that I can't talk about, where in terms of Josephine, the main character, she does advocate for her rights. She does work also with her friends to think about what could make the world a better place. She's ambivalent too, because so much of love in this world is still tied into conforming with the state. And I wanted to also touch on my own feelings about marriage, where I am married, but it's still a very complicated thing for me, because it's always tied in like social status and well-being. I have insurance because I am married. I feel like when you're past a certain age, especially in places like the Midwest, you get treated a little better by people if you're married. And part of the novel was based on kind of this thing that I thought was really funny, where I noticed anytime someone hit about 28 and they weren't married, people were kind of like, what's wrong with you? Especially your older relatives. And I thought that was like a really funny concept to kind of bring into the novel, but it still does get into, even the sovereignty over love exists. And again, it's kicking people out. I don't know. I just ran out of steam a little bit, but that was a really complicated, long thought.
So many beautiful things are wrapped up in what you just said. And something that struck me very deeply was this sense of being free to come, being free to go, being free to be family. One thing that was inherent in what you were saying, but you didn't say it explicitly, was you're free to be exactly who you are. You're free to be your own authentic version of yourself, not what has been prescribed to you, right? Sometimes when I think about sovereignty, I think about the way in which so many people outsource their own authority without even thinking about it, right? They just hand off their own ability to discern and to find truth. And what a loss that is for a whole, full human being to live a whole, full, expressive life. I'm curious about, because you touched on friendships, and it makes me think about Angie, right? Angie and Josephine, and the way they have of understanding each other and of seeing each other and holding space for each other. The games that they play and the writing that they do. I mean, something, I'm sure people have said this to you, Megan, but like, also this book is so funny. Like, there were times where I just was like, yes, and laughing along with the points that you were making and how you were making them. But Midwestern or white, right? I'm on my period about the girl that goes into Sephora, right? And taking that and amping it up. And I'm just, I'm curious where the inspiration for that came from. I would just love to know how that came about.
So, okay, I'll go to the jokes, but first I'll talk about their friendship a little bit. I thought it was really important in a novel like this, if it was going to be about feminist issues, to show like how friendships can be like deeply romantic and soul satisfying without having physical affection. And I think sometimes the best friendships are where, even as adults, you're really comfortable having your own little world. You find a way to play with one another. You keep building and building these things, and you let your imagination speak to one another. And it's it's beautiful when it happens, and it's so satisfying. And then for the jokes, it was just finally me getting a chance to just play around. I felt like my first book, it's that kind of regret I had where I think my first book is good and people say it's funny, but every time they said it was funny, I was like, I could be funnier. I could actually like try to write jokes and play around. And what is it like to have a character who's actually wants to be funny, but also kind of keeps that secret? Like Jo doesn't share the videos. She's scared to let that humorous side of her out in the world. And I also think the more I talk about this book, that it reflects a lot of women I know where once you get to know them, they are the funniest people you've ever met. But most of the time, they, for whatever reason, either because like a practice type of femininity or feeling like they have to be professional, they keep it all locked in. And then it's only like when they let you in, like they give you the key to themselves, that you get to see, oh, you're so funny. You're maybe one of the funniest people I've ever met.
Yeah, it's beautiful. There's that one passage where Josephine's being described as the way in which she just says something. It's not even funny. It's just sort of that they know each other so well, right? And I'm sure that you have friends like this as well. When you know each other so intimately well, and the other person just starts talking about their day or telling a story, and you're already in fits of laughter.
Yeah.
Because of the intimacy just that you're speaking to, that's been built into their friendship, and how much space and room there is. Something that you said about prescribed femininity, right? Or performing one's identity, and having that true space to connect and be vulnerable, and which is so beautifully put on the page between Josephine and Angie. But where did you come up with like Midwestern or white? Or had you been thinking about that? Had you been talking about that with friends? Had you just been like,
I've been talking about that with my brother. Like, it's one of the things that we joke about sometimes, about when people say the word Midwestern. And there are a few other writers I know who also grew up in the Midwest. And every once in a while, one of us would say it to each other and be like, yeah, this is something real. I mean, you grew up in Ohio. I'm sure you have a million Midwestern or white.
So many.
Yeah, just.
But that sort of the bubbling up from potentially being curious as a reader, like where is the author's experience is bubbling up into the character's life, even though the characters are characters and very much themselves and not you in the novel, but those places of overlap or of close proximity. There's another place that happens like that at the party. And on page 102, 103, I just want to, I don't think there's any spoilers here at all. And there's just something about a particular kind, a reality at the top of page 102. A woman with beautiful long black hair stood close to me and asked me a question. I pretended not to hear her. She repeated it. Or, are you black or Mexican? She tried again. Give me $20, I said, and I'll tell you. Why? Are you white or are you white? Now, Megan, I've heard a lot of responses. I haven't heard that response. And I just was so refreshed to hear how Jo responded in that moment. Did you want to say anything else about that?
No, other than the number of times I've wanted to ask people that question. Although, again, I mean, I don't usually get it, but I've heard people question, like my younger sister, who is much more white passing, about her identity or heritage. I mean, sometimes people do confuse me for being Afro-Latina, and I always have to like gently say, no, I mean, I'm happy. I wish I sometimes just had that connection, but no, I'm black. Not
Well, it also, I mean, it also, made me think of something that question didn't explicitly say, but that people of color have had to deal with. And I feel like it'll die out at some point, but it keeps just going, which is the question, what are you, right? And in that moment, feeling not human and othered and distrusted and all, for however, why ever they ask it. But the ways in which there is that that disruption in the connection and in relationship and relating. So I was curious about some of that. There's also something that I noticed. This is something sort of writer to writer that I wanted to ask you. I have several writing questions, and it seems like we're getting some good questions in the chat, which I'm really excited about. On page 79, there's a pattern that I noticed in the book where it's like all of these absurd, fantastical things happen. They're listed, right? I'm looking at the paragraph in the middle of the page. To be considered a true witch in the state of Michigan, you have to have at least 3 acts of magic on the official record. Could you read just that paragraph? Would you be willing to do that?
Yeah, I can definitely do that. To be considered a true witch in the state of Michigan, you have to have at least 3 acts of magic on the official record. They don't have to be large magical events. They can be something as simple as a dream written down that predicts an event with 70% accuracy. I once looked it up, and there are 4 registered witches in the state. Guidelines are vague about what happens: state stewardship, insurance policies, registrations. There's this precise clause that no witch is allowed on the Mackinac or Ambassador bridges because of infrastructure concerns. But each plan is subject to approval by the State Committee for Witch Regulations. Sometimes people say, isn't it lucky to be a woman now?
And I love the pattern of that throughout the entire book, because then it's continuously followed by this comment that's current and true and relevant. And you're reading along and you're thinking like, oh my goodness, like this is completely absurd, the way in which these women are treated. And then you get to the end, and each time there's this statement that's like, and these are the times that we're living in. And so it seems as though you continue to write books heavily steeped in social commentary and political, as if that's something not to do when it's, I think everyone is writing politically, just because of who you are, where you come from, right? Sometimes you don't say that. But I'm curious as how you enter story and what keeps you interested in story. Is that a driving factor, that it's also a way of saying what needs to be said and isn't always said?
You know, it's one of those strange things where what keeps me writing a story, it's both like a mixture of personal and like world building questions. And I don't think that you can build any world in a novel that is set. I don't think you can build any world in a novel that isn't inherently political, like you said. But usually it's the personal questions that propel me through it. How does this character react to this? How do they feel about this? How do they live in this world? And I feel like if you're being honest about the way people live, well, it's always going to be political. And if you're writing about a Black woman today, then there's always going to be a hint of social justice, as long as you think about like the great wheel of oppression, where everybody is both oppressor and oppressed.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of impossible to like divorce it, especially when you're writing about a person of color. Mm-hmm. But for me, it is questions. It's thinking really deeply, because I think personally, although a lot of time I see this in other people's writing too, is that like the route to making a novel especially feel alive, it's from the reactions. Mm-hmm. If a character is actually reacting on the page to the world that you've built, to what things are being said, to how they move through it, that's how you know the book is working. Because it's not just, let's keep moving on. You let them pause. And it might sometimes be in the questions they ask. It might be in their body. And sometimes it is just in them having to do a little comeback like you read earlier. Like, this is happening to me. And I think sometimes it's my frustration with novels that are scared of being political, where I've read a lot. I mean, I read all the time still, but usually when I can tell a novel's scared of like that of politics or what they feel are politics, even though, again, if you have just all white people talking together in New York City, that's political and you've made a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's in terms of the things that the characters don't get a chance to process or register. I see it a lot where like someone encounters something racist or wrong and they notice it, they observe it, and then the writer moves on. They don't want to say anything. They don't want to let the character say anything. But most of the time, when people do have a chance to process, unless they're firmly aligned with those values, they're at least thoughtful. They're at least in a space where they're thinking really deeply about their relationship to other people. Some of us are able to talk immediately, and some of us have to think. But I think it's really important, the more you write a novel, to think about when are you letting your character actually sit in a space? Because so often, especially in novels, you're kind of told like, let's go, let's go, let's go.
Yeah.
But maybe the luckiest thing about this novel is that I don't think, like my editor, he didn't say let's go. His notes were often, we can sit with this. You don't have to keep going. And it was, I think, one of the biggest gifts I'll ever be given in my career is someone explicitly telling me, let's sit here for a minute. Let Jo have more time. Let her talk.
That's a really powerful response. Thank you so much. We have a question from Tara Campbell. Did you start out wanting to write about human rights, social justice, and then wind up incorporating magic? Or did you start writing about magic and social justice bubbled up?
The latter. So I started writing about magic and social justice bubbled up because, especially, I think if you're writing about witches or power, it's one of the things I think is like delicious about witchcraft is that you can think about it as another way to amass power that isn't about money. It's not about social standing or who you're with. It's about knowledge. It's about listening to the earth. It's about taking the time to be away from others and then sharing with other people. If you're using like the traditional folktale sense, that isn't about like villainizing people who want to be away from the community and learn and not participate in the social circles. Social circles is such a tongue twister for me.
It definitely is.
Yeah, but I think it's really easy that once you start writing about magic, and especially about magic with women, you are thinking about the way women or people who don't identify as women or men can accumulate power outside the social structure. Thanks for the question, Tara. Thanks for coming out.
Yeah, that was a great question to include. One of the things also beyond the magic, beyond the social commentary is you as a poet, as you starting out as a poet, which is evident in the prose. Thank you so much for that. And the way in which concrete sensory detail lands in the body, right? The sense of smell, which is so hard to write, but which is included constantly in this book. I'm curious about how your early beginnings as a poet or interested in poetry, how that continues to shape you in your prose and your story writing.
I think what poetry has done for me and continues to do for me, one, it's kind of a blessing that I don't want to be a poet anymore, simply because reading poetry, it's one of those things that like replenishes me now. it gives me pleasure. And before, when I was kind of forcing myself to stay as a poet, which is so long ago now to me, but it still feels a little fresh, is the fact that like I stopped finding pleasure in reading poetry because I was so concerned about myself and just thinking too hard about why it wasn't good anymore. Why wasn't I having fun? And it's because I wanted to tell stories. I really, really, really wanted to tell stories in the traditional sense. And like having a professor who gave me the grace was like, Megan, you clearly want to do this. Why are you making yourself miserable? And sometimes what's the biggest gift anybody can give you of why are you hitting your head on this? Stop. But I think the other thing that I think prose writers especially could learn a lot from poetry is the ways that your paragraphs don't always have to be from point A to point B. That a beautiful paragraph can function as its own miniature world, and you can learn a lot from couplets or from even a very short, just poem sometimes, not even just the couplet, but you're thinking a lot about the ways that you can still get meaning and beauty, but your reader won't predict where the paragraph is going. And I mean, there are some prose writers who are so good at that, but poetry is kind of the easiest place to start to send people where, like I'm thinking about like Diane Seuss's Frank right now, where I was reading it over the summer, and it was simultaneously telling a story about this speaker of the poem, but it would bridge off suddenly into details, and then suddenly emotional devastation that made the details that came before it feel even more poignant. And it's another way I think where prose writers could think about like the gaze of the line even, where so often we treat the third person, especially the third person closed, as kind of this neutral state. But it's not. You're always building the limits of its intelligence and determining where it's looking. And I think poets sometimes do that a lot better in terms of how often detail and attention and love can build a voice. And I think prose writers sometimes think that neutrality is better. But I don't know if I agree on that.
I hear you. So you teach undergraduate creative writing and master's students in creative writing. Is that correct? Yeah.
That's correct.
What's the what do you notice as their sort of greatest blessing and greatest curse as far as them orienting around writing and the process of writing?
Ooh, okay. I think a well-functioning undergraduate creative writing classroom, and I've been lucky enough to have a lot of those over the past few years. They still treat each other like community. You don't if you're building the class right, I mean, yeah, you're gonna have some people who are like, I'm just here to get through, and that's fine, but those are the ones who sometimes take more risk in their work because they're just here to get by. So who cares if I write this wild story and then someone tricks them into wanting to be a writer because they wrote a wild story that's exciting. And that someone is usually me, but sometimes it's one of their classmates. And I think it's kind of the greatest strength of an undergrad classroom sometimes is that they still want to have fun. They still at heart want to play, and they just want someone to take them seriously. It's kind of the advice I'm starting to give my grad students. Like if you come into the classroom for undergrads and you take them seriously, they will love you. Most of them are there to have someone tell them you can do this, to pay attention and to nurture them. And I think on the opposite side, I think it's much harder to build community among graduate students because already they've kind of been indoctrinated into the idea that the writing world, you're all alone. There's room for only one. And then a lot of the work I think I'm doing beyond taking like what they understand and making it so that they can talk deeply about it. It's all right, you need each other. And so it's a lot of workshop doesn't have to be this place where you make each other miserable. This is a place where you find the people who are going to keep you writing, who want you to succeed. And you also need to build in yourself the ability to want other people to succeed, because their successes aren't going to take anything from you. You should always be opening the door for each other.
It's so important to hear that. It's so important to hear that, Megan, again and again and again. And I love that you share that with your students. I feel like it should just be in neon somewhere above the archway of every MFA program.
Truly.
Because it's the way in which we can be in true respect with ourselves and with each other, right? I think this goes again to underpinnings of this book, which is so brilliant around creativity and imagination, and also the real need to have that place and that space and that time to do that, but also that magic isn't activated unless it's in community together, right? It continues to point at that, and I feel like that's a constant invitation. As a last question, I would love to know, because I'm always talking to my students about this, is how you take care of yourself, right? How to live as a writer sustainably and not to cause more harm to oneself, right? And you've mentioned play so many times that that's also another word that I want to just put above my writing space to constantly remember to have that sense of play. But if you could speak to how you take care of yourself, or how you suggest writers take care of themselves, especially women and BIPOC folks.
Yeah, it's also really interesting because I've heard this question this week just from grad students, and also just from another writer too. So, and now you're another writer who's asking me a variation on it. And some of it is what I touched on, is writing is not therapy. You have to genuinely take care of yourself and find many different ways, because even therapy sometimes is not enough. But it's also, I always tell people when they're asking me, like, how am I still writing? Or how did I even start writing the second book? Is that, and it's still, and I don't want to make this as like, I'm this perfect person or I'm not competitive. I'm a very competitive person. I'm mostly competitive with myself though, which means I'm also meaner to myself than I think a lot of people are. But I always return to play. If writing needs to be fun to me, it doesn't have to be like this perfect time every time. But I always remind myself the fun isn't awards or recognition. There's no guarantee it will keep happening. There's no guarantee that I'll keep getting paid for my writing. And so the thing I have to go back to is the joy I feel in thinking deeply about the world, in writing, in being imaginative. Because, yeah, the worst part of writing is probably the sitting at the desk and trying to figure things out. The best part of writing is being imaginative, about getting to make little jokes, about making people that maybe other people will fall in love with. The pleasure of it. And so I have to constantly keep finding ways to just play in it and enjoy myself, because everything else, they're not going to make me stay writing. But this will help me have a long relationship, even when the other things go away.
Thank you so much, Megan.
Thank you.
Wow. You guys, this is easily one of my favorite conversations in 20 years of bookselling. It was a gift. Thank you both so much. I very rarely walked away from a conversation where I've read both of your books and love both of your books, but I want to go back into both of your books and reread your books, because Jamie and Megan, you just gave us like just a whole world, to think about. And I appreciate that so much. I appreciate you both so much, and for giving us these stories and also nurturing that community that's coming up. And I love the conversation about the MFA and undergrad students. So thank you both so much. So much.
And thank you for having us talk to each other. Jamie, this was truly wonderful. I thank you.
I appreciate you so much, Megan, and your work in the world, and wish you continued success. Angela, thank you so much again for all that you do. That's so critical to us. We deeply value you and all that you do. And I will definitely follow up, Megan, with the book that I mentioned.
Thank you.
Everybody needs these books. Everybody needs the book. And Jamie's book too. Thank you both. Thank you everybody for coming. Much love to Tara. Tara's a good friend of Duende. We would not exist without her. It was a beautiful question that she gets. So, and thank you to the Word. Thank you everybody. Have a good night.